Hello everyone, welcome back to my workbench up here in the study at Donget's Model Railway. Today I'm starting a new series. In this series we're going to look at how to arrange coaches into believable trains. If you are the kind of modeller who has a scale model of a real location, set at a specific date in history and regularly pore through old photographs and documents to work out exactly how the 853 to town was made up, I'm sure I'll see you in the comments complaining about just how basic this is and how I've missed out so many details. Firstly, I know I've cut so much from the script and turned what was looking like a single video into a series, as it'd be far too big for people if I put it all in one place. Secondly, great! Please do share your knowledge in the comment section below. I love learning more about coaching stock formations and all the local differences from the general rules, how the rules changed over time, and I'm sure your knowledge will benefit other viewers too. However, you probably aren't the target audience for this video. This video is more addressed to the kind of people who have a glorified circle around their loft, shed, garage, or study, representing a fictional location. What I want to achieve is to get people to look in more detail at the coaches they have and how they go together to make trains, as people have a tendency to be too rigid with things that they shouldn't worry about quite so much, and not rigid enough with things that they should be more strict with. Often this doesn't produce a realistic train, as certain types of coaches are required to be present in a train to make it functional. Other types have limits as to how many would appear or where they would be in the train. First, let's cover a bit about train length. Mainline expresses were often 12 to 13 coaches and could occasionally be more. In model form, this takes up a lot of space. In 00 scale, a full-length express is getting close to 4 metres in length. That's a lot of train to find somewhere to fit. Often the trains we represent in miniature are significantly shorter than the real thing. The vast majority of us are not blessed with the kind of space required to assemble full-length trains, let alone give them somewhere to run. My terminus station will handle a maximum train length of 8 to 9 coaches depending on the length of the individual coaches. I have a decent amount of space, but by no means can I run a full-scale length express train. The obvious answer for how to model shorter trains is to model shorter trains, by which I mean find a prototype location that ran shorter trains and model a location like that one. That's definitely worth bearing in mind if you have a small space. You can't expect to properly represent a prestigious express if you are limited to 3-coach trains. But it's also rather limiting. I find the general rule is that I can create a believable representation of a given train in a shade over half the length of the real thing. Every now and then I'll give you a rule about how trains are made up. A lot of rules are not particularly hard. They were bent and broken all the time in real life. It was more of an aspirational goal than a hard requirement. For almost every rule there's an exception to it somewhere, and someone will be along in the comments, maybe even with a photo to show how that rule wasn't always followed. You should note, however, that where rules were broken in real life there was a compelling reason to do so. That reason may have been a local operational requirement, or it may have been lack of provision or access to something important. Be selective with breaking rules. If you break one rule, and you have an operational reason to have done so that's believable should your model railway have existed as a real location, that's fine. But break a whole bunch of rules all at the same time, and everything starts to look much less believable. Occasionally, there's a hard rule that you really can't break, because the train doesn't work if you do. I'll try and point these out where we come into contact with them. When we're talking about coaches, it's important we describe them precisely. The railway has a set of words it uses, each of which has a precise meaning and which is important for operating reasons, and modelers often misunderstand. These words are also abbreviated into the also much misunderstood coach codes. As an example of why it's important to understand and use the correct words, let's have a look at Hornby's current issue of their TT120 magazine. In this article, they repeatedly refer to this coach here as a brake corridor composite, or occasionally brake composite corridor, which it is not. It is a brake second corridor, or BSK. An actual brake composite corridor, or BCK, is a real but different coach that they have not made in TT120 scale. Let's have a look at each different type of coach. A brake coach is a coach with guards accommodation in it. In the British Railways coach coding system, this is the letter B. It gets the name because there is a handbrake control in the guards compartment. Every train must have a vehicle with guards accommodation in it somewhere in the train. Don't break this rule. Every rake of coaches parked without a locomotive attached needs a handbrake applied, as the train brake can bleed off over time. If a partial rake without a brake coach is stopped somewhere, for example in a depot while shunting is taking place, you have to use wheel chocks to keep it still. Once the train brake bleeds off, if there are no handbrakes applied or wheel chocks used, that rake is going to go walkies by itself. Having a minimum of one brake vehicle somewhere in a train is a hard operational requirement. What type that brake vehicle is, where it is in the train, and how many you should have varies significantly with location, era, train length, and what the train is doing. In the steam era, the expectation was that you had a brake vehicle at both ends of the train with the van section facing outwards. But while this is the general rule, there are more exceptions to it than you can shake a stick at. Short trains didn't have two. Trains of only 2 coaches frequently had only 1 brake coach. Trains of 3 coaches may have had 1 or 2, depending on what it was doing. It's really only from 4 coaches and up that the 2 brake coach expectation was reliably hit. Longer trains may have had more than 2. Trains that split into pieces en route should have a brake coach at each end of each part. In a long train, it would not be unrealistic to see 2 coaches van to van in the middle of such a train. A train formed this way is clearly going to be split further on down the route. If one of the parts would be 3 coaches or less when removed, or if it is not taken further than the location it is being detached, perhaps there is only 1 van end in this part, and the combined train would thus have only 3 brake coaches. For services where additional luggage or mail space is required, 1 or more full brake coaches could be added. These can be used in addition to a normal brake coach or instead of one. Where a train was expected to have a brake vehicle at either end, this was fairly reliably achieved, but getting them the right way round was more of a problem. It was not uncommon to see a brake vehicle the wrong way round. The reason for this is it's relatively straightforward to move vehicles to the right place in a train if they turn up in the wrong order at the carriage sidings. But to flip a vehicle around requires taking it somewhere where that can happen, which typically isn't possible within the confines of a set of carriage sidings. They'd have to ask the signaller for a path somewhere to do that, and thus it's easier to just put it on the wrong way round. Having vehicles the right way round gets a lot more reliable when trains start being made into fixed sets that stay together and don't get shunted. When that started happening depends on the region. It can be as early as the 1920s on the Southern Railway, and as late as the second half of the 1980s on the West Coast Main Line. In the very late 1960s, after the demise of steam, the expectation changed from a minimum of 2 brake vehicles per train to just 1, although many still ran with more, either because the van capacity is required or the train divided en route. The expectation for the brake to be at the end was also dropped. This allowed a single brake van to be moved to the middle of the train for easier sighting in both directions down platforms, should that be required. However, many trains still continued to run as they had done before because there was no compelling reason to change how the train was formed up. The majority of the passengers in any train are travelling in what we call standard class today. This is denoted with the letter S. Before 1987, this was called second class, still S, and before 1956 it was called third class, with the letter T. In the era of third class, there were trains with 3 distinct classes, first, second and third, but these were boat train services with through ticketing to the continent. Boat train services mostly disappeared when business travel to Europe shifted from sea to air. You may occasionally encounter a coach described as a boat second. This would have been built as a dedicated second-class coach in the boat train era. It does not mean it was equipped for travel on a train ferry. First class is denoted by the letter F. A typical mainline express would have around 30% of the train being first class accommodation, and this is where you would find most of the all first class coaches in use. All first class coaches turned out not to be desirable when cascaded to secondary routes, as relatively few first class tickets are sold away from primary mainline routes. Railways generally optimised express trains for the convenience of first class passengers. The first class coaches will normally be all together in the train as a block and at the town end of major trains. Named expresses with a higher than normal amount of first class and all Pullman services did exist, but they are rare cases and relatively well documented. If you want to reproduce one of these, you should be able to find information on it relatively easily. Some coaches have multiple classes of accommodation. These are called composite coaches and use the letter C. Composite just means something that is made of various different parts, and a composite coach will have some first and some standard or second class. Composite coaches were originally the main way of providing first-class accommodation in nearly every cross-country or regional train. Compartment or non-corridor coaches have a very high seated capacity at the cost of not allowing people to move around the train. These are appropriate for short-distance commuter or local services. They weren't often mixed with corridor coaches in the same train. There is no letter to signify a compartment coach. This is the default state. You can recognise these because there is a door on both sides in every compartment. Corridor coaches are a modification of a compartment coach. Each group of seats is still walled off from the other in the same way, but instead of the compartment having a door to each side of the train, on one side it opens into an internal corridor which allows people to leave their seat and move around the train. They were the standard long-distance coach for a long time. Most Mark I coaches built were corridor coaches. Corridor coaches get the suffix letter K at the end of the coach code. You'd think it would be C, but we already used this for composite coaches. A second corridor is thus an SK. Open coaches are so named because they are open inside. There are no walls separating the groups of seats. Open coaches use the suffix O. These were initially built as tourist coaches used on dedicated trains to holiday destinations. Second class moved to an open by default layout in the 1960s, but Mark I's second corridor coaches continued to operate well into the 1980s. Open firsts did not become the standard until the early 1970s, but again, first-class compartment stock could be seen into the 1990s where earlier built stock continued to operate. Where tourist and normal second opens existed, prefix T is added to the tourist coaches, leading to the TSO coach being the tourist second open. At some point the tourist designation was dropped and these coaches just became standard opens. There was also one more coach type. If you remove the internal partitions from a compartment coach, you get a high-density open coach suitable for commuter service that does not allow people to move about the train, but does allow people to move about the coach. This is an open non-gangwayed coach. You'll see a second open non-gangway recorded as an SONG. There weren't many of these produced, but they did exist. Most services don't have onboard catering. Onboard catering is generally only provided on long-distance trains with an expected travel time of 3 hours or more, and where people were mostly expected to travel for the majority of that distance. Up to the early 1950s, the assumption was that a restaurant-style service was required. You'd get up from your seat, go to the restaurant, sit in the restaurant and eat, and then go back to your seat afterwards. This was enabled by providing an onboard kitchen plus a space with restaurant-style seating. Most kitchen cars have a kitchen occupying half the coach, plus some restaurant seating in the other half. These can also serve an adjacent coach with all restaurant seating connected at the kitchen end. A handful were full kitchen cars, which served an all-restaurant coach on either side. These triple sets were intended for the most prestigious services. There was generally only one kitchen per train, although the very highest profile trains, and all Pullman service, may well have had more. In the rare case that there is more than one kitchen, they are not right next to each other. Each one would have its own local restaurant seating to serve. All food service cars, whether they technically have restaurant-style seating or not, use the letter R for restaurant. Kitchens typically, but not always, get the letter K. And yes, this collides with corridor, but no restaurant is ever a corridor coach. Food service is always in open conditions. So we know an RK would be a restaurant kitchen, as there's no such thing as a restaurant corridor. Amusingly, an RK is the one car type that doesn't have any seating. It's the full coach kitchen I mentioned, and it should have a restaurant second open and a restaurant first open on either side of it. By the beginning of the 1960s, it was clear that selling food that passengers took back to their seats was preferable to restaurant-style at-table service. This reduced the number of seats required in the train, the number of staff required, and also prompted the move towards second open coaches being the standard for new builds. The buffet coach became the standard catering offering as a result. Buffet coaches use the letter B. These vary from coaches which are mostly normal seating, but also have a small buffet counter, like a micro buffet, or RMB, up to a restaurant buffet, RB, which has a large buffet counter, but also retains a kitchen and a small amount of restaurant-style seating. Restaurant open coaches of any class don't typically travel around without an attached kitchen car of some kind. Given the seating is not fixed down, they didn't make good day coaches, and when at-seat service was scaled back, they were typically retired. Even when they were in service, specific restaurant opens were not always available. Normal open coaches with fixed seating would often be used adjacent to kitchen cars instead. The date when dedicated restaurant opens stopped being used varies by region. The eastern region persisted with it the longest. Catering sets were normally put in the middle of the train between the two classes. This is for the convenience of first-class passengers, so they don't have to have third-class passengers walking past on their way to the buffet, and also so that they don't have to walk past third-class passengers on their way to the buffet. Catering may also be put at the end of the train, for example if it was scheduled not to travel the entire length of the journey. This makes it easier to remove from the train. As much as the railway loves taking care of its first-class passengers, its own operational convenience comes first. What have we learned today? Brake coaches have a van and guards accommodation. You need at least one. You could very well have more than one. Third class, or second or standard class coaches should be the majority of your train. Compartment on non-gangway stock is for short-distance, high-density service. Long-distance trains, whether that is intercity, cross-country or regional services, should be made up of corridor or open stock. The more important the cities the train connects, the higher the proportion of first class provided. Regional services to a branch line terminus in a field in the middle of nowhere will get almost none. Your first class accommodation goes in a block at the end of the train nearest the main entrance exit for the biggest city. As that's probably a terminus station, it's probably at the end of the train. Your catering goes in the middle of the train at one end of your first class section. If you are enjoying this video or finding it useful, hit the like button. If you want to see more of my layout or the stock I run on it, hit the subscribe button. If you have a question, comment or suggestion, write it in the comment section below. See you next time up here in the study at Donget's Model Railway.